So we're talking about this paradox. I'm not sure that we really are going to find a definite solution to the problem. It's, for good reasons, it's a paradox, but we'll see. The problem is this one, that honeybees are unique, you know that already, in many aspects, but they are also unique in the sense that the old queen leaves the colony with a swarm and it's a young queen that takes over. And when you compare the honeybees with other eusocial insects, even with other eusocial insects that are also Hymenoptera, you'll find that those are doing a different thing. So ants, an ant queen that starts reproduction, she loses her wings, and so she doesn't have an option to move on. And the same holds for not losing the wings, but stingless bees also. The mother stays at home. Sometimes she is joined in several species by daughters that stay home, but she also stays always at home. And termites also, they are not Hymenoptera, but once they start reproduction, they shed off their wings and they stay in a nest, and it's the young queens that will disperse. Now we can extend this comparison a little bit further by looking at other animals, and throughout the animal kingdom you find that mothers have a tendency to stay at home and daughters have a tendency either to stay also at home when they're social animals and they form group, but it's never the old mother that goes away out of the place where she lives and she doesn't start a new life. It is the young ones that do the dispersal. And that's true for birds and it's true for mammals. The good thing is that there should always be some tiny exceptions. And I scrutinized the literature on mammals, and after lots and lots of reading, I could find 3 species where the mother occasionally disperses and leaves her territory or her nest to a daughter. But even in those species, and you see them here, the Columbia ground squirrel and the American red squirrel and kangaroo rats, as a rule, the mother stays at home. And it's only in exceptional circumstances that the mother moves away. Now, knowing that, if all the animals have daughters that disperse, we know that honeybees in a very, very far past also would have stayed home. So it is an acquired character in the honeybees. The way I think about this problem is different from most of the beekeepers. I always say I'm an evolutionary ecologist, and evolutionary ecologists, they are like children. They always ask why. And so when I talk to beekeepers, then the beekeepers, they have answers to this question. Say, oh yes, of course the old queen has to leave because she's chased away by the workers. Or they answer, if she wouldn't go away, then she would be killed by a young queen. And then again I ask, why? Because that's not the answer I want. It's not a mechanism I want to understand. I want to understand the evolutionary origin. Why somewhere in the deep past, queen honeybees have decided no longer to stay at home but to move out. So, and that's the question that we are going to address. In evolutionary biology, we always talk about the fitness of something. So the hidden idea is that a behavior has been selected by natural selection because it has an advantage to do so, and it is a disadvantage to do the things differently. So that we could decide just by thinking that it must have benefited the queen and her relatives that she leaves and it's not the daughter that leaves. Now that brings us a little step closer to the solution of the problem, because then we can start to try to find arguments to show that indeed it's the better decision. In theoretical biology that deals with evolution, there are two schools. One of these schools is the school of the geneticist. It has been founded in your country by Ronald Fisher and by Haldane in the 30s. And so they look always at genes. But then in the 70s of last century, another school came up, also in your country, and it was John Krebs and his friends that started to say, well, we have to look at the behavior of animals and see how the behavior contributes to the fitness, and we cannot deal directly with the genes because we don't know enough about the genes. So there are two approaches. Now first I will apply this John Krebs approach, and then we'll see what answer we get. And then later I will use the Haldane-Fisher approach, and we'll look at genes. So now we start from the queen's viewpoint. And so we say that the queen must have some benefit by leaving. It must be better for her to leave, because if it was worse, then she should stay home. It's as simple as that. And so we have somehow to calculate whether the decision to leave gives more rewards than the decision to stay. And to do calculations, we need some data. And that is difficult, because what we want to do is we want to look at bees which do not get assistance from beekeepers. Because the problem is that if you have a swarm, then, and you catch the swarm, then you will take care of it because you want it to produce honey the next season. So that changes the expectations for the queen. So we want to have queens that disperse and live in nature and see how they do on themselves. And we also want to know what happens with the remains of the colony, which is left by the old queen and the swarm, how they fare. And then we can say, okay, moving gives that sort of fitness returns. Staying where you are gives that sort of fitness returns. There's some problems with it, but we'll discover those. Now, I've been looking very hard in the literature, but there are very, very few data. There are only two sets of data, and they have been collected by Tom Seeley in Arnold Forest. And there he has looked at colonies that swarmed and colonies that did not swarm, and he has looked at the survival of those. And so first he published in '78 an article that said an established colony has 80% chance that it's still there after the next winter, so that it has survived into the new season. But a newly found swarm that has dispersed and started a life somewhere else has only a chance of 29%. And then, almost 40 years later, he repeated the experiment, and he found very similar figures. And so we used the average between the two sets of data. So we say, established colonies have a chance to survive until the next season of 82%, and newly founded colonies that are founded by swarms have a probability of still being there after the winter of 26%. And now we can start to see what it means. Now you would expect these data, they are rather shocking, and maybe they have to do with the fact that Arnold Forest is in upstate New York, and upstate New York has horrible winters, very cold, -40 is not exceptional, and the winters are long and spring is short, and for the rest it's very good bee country, but overwintering is not an easy task for bees there. Now, you must imagine a swarm that has found a hollow tree to start a nest. It has to invest a lot. First of all, it has to build new combs, and that's quite expensive because you need 4 times the weight in honey to make wax. And of course, when they start, they don't have a food stock, and they have to build up a stock of food to survive the winter. So on basis of that, you would already expect that swarms are doing less well than the old nest where they come from, because the old nest, there's still, the wax combs are there and there is still stock. So it's easier for the new queen to make that at the end of the season there is enough food to overwinter. So we understand, we expect the difference, and we understand it to a certain degree. We go on with our thinking about the problem and say a queen leaving has a much lower chance to survive to the next winter. How could that be better for her to do? On first sight, it looks horrible. She shouldn't. But you could say, well, but maybe by leaving, she gives her daughter a better chance to survive. And she is related to her daughter, of course, for 50%. So that may compensate. Now we can start to calculate. So we say 50% of the daughter queen genes, they come from the mother, so their relatedness is half. Now, then we can calculate the benefit for the mother, the chance that they will survive times the relatedness. Now the queen is totally related to herself, so the mother has a chance of 26, and she is 400% related, and the daughter has a chance of 82%, but we have to discount for the fact that it's only related for 50%, and then we come to a total of 67%. What would happen if the queen would stay at home? Then she gets 0.82 plus half times 26, and that gives 0.95. We have done the calculations, and we have ended in a dead-end street, because our calculations tell us that the mother queen should stay at home. That's not what we wanted. Now, we have to wriggle out of this problem in some way. So, first of all, we say, is the survival of a swarm always that low? Because we have only this one example from Sealy. And so we could argue that these severe winters make that the difference between the two strategies is much larger there than in the rest of the world, and certainly here where the winters are mild. So then we can see, if you redo the calculations, maybe we can find that in other situations it might be better for the old queen. If you try that, you could argue, I have argued that it's understandable that a swarm has a lower survival chance because it has to build up a nest and it has to build up a stock. And so you would expect that it is always lower than staying at home. But even if you assume that the values are similar, then still leaving for the old queen is not better. In the extreme case, it's as good. Leaving is then as good as staying home. And so that cannot have driven the evolution of that behavior. So let's abandon this approach, and let's start to look at a genetic approach. See if we, by that other approach, can do a little bit better. So we have a theoretical reasoning. We say, suppose that in the old world, queens were always staying at home, And now there is a mutation, and the mutation is a dominant allele. An allele is a variant of a gene, and we call it A. And so that this new allele, this mutation, makes that the mother will leave with a swarm after overwintering, whereas in the past the bees did the opposite. And the mother, he has received the allele from one of her parents. But because it's a dominant allele, it's always expressed, so it doesn't matter if she got it from her father or from her mother, she will have this behavior. And also because it's a dominant allele, there's a good chance that she also gives it to her daughter. Daughters that don't get it are not in our reasoning. But half of the daughters, they get that allele and then they have that behavior also. Because if not, they would both leave. And that would be a small catastrophe, I think. Now we get the same, now we're using the same figures that we used before. So when the mother leaves with a swarm, she has a probability, and the swarm has a probability to survive of 26%. And her daughter that stays at home, she benefits from the fact that the mother leaves, and she has, I have written, an increased survival probability. And that's what we need, but we only know she has, in the case of the data of Sealy, she has a survival probability of 84%. And then we can say, when, under what circumstances, would the mutant, which is at that moment very rare, we have only 2 copies of the mutant, and all the other bees are old world bees and they don't have it. And so what we need is that this new allele is going to spread through the population until all honeybees have it. The allele A can spread if the benefit to the original colony more than compensates for the loss of A copies as a result of the fact that the mother queen who leaves has such a low survival probability. And now we have to look at circumstances to find that the A allele will spread. You can calculate from the data of Sealy that that's only true if the benefit to the old colony is more than 0.61. And so now we have to find circumstances in which this would happen. And that will happen only if for some reason the original colony has a much better survival if the old queen leaves. That it would not have the same survival if the old queen would stay. Now we're getting closer to a solution. To explain the solution to you, we do a step back. We are talking about the fact that honeybees are very vulnerable, in principle, to illnesses like viruses and bacteria. And the reason for that is that honeybees have only 1 generation per year, while bacteria and viruses, they have many generations per day. They can have a generation in 20 minutes. And so bacteria and viruses, when they are there, they occur in large numbers and they multiply very, very quickly. And each time they multiply, new copies of their genes must be made. And there are chances that there are errors in making these copies. They're called mutations. And so we know that in bacteria and viruses, the mutation rate is much higher than in honeybees. Because honeybees have small populations, because we cannot count all the workers, we can only count the number of queens and the number of drones. And then you end up with a large area and a relatively small number of reproducing animals. So the problem that honeybees have is, with their long generation time and low population density, the probability that they make useful mutations is very, very small. Bacteria and viruses and their hosts, they are in an arms race So bacteria change, viruses change, and then the hosts must adjust their immune system, and they must also change. But if you have a very low mutation rate, changing is not going so fast. So on first sight, the bacteria and the viruses have an enormous advantage. And added to that, the nest temperature, the temperature of the brood in honeybees, is around 35 degrees. And that's the optimal temperature to breed viruses and bacteria. So that's not good. And then those bees, they live in close contact, and they are exchanging food the whole time. And so once there is one bee infected with pathogens, it will spread through a colony quite fast. So it looks that honeybees are in dire straits, but fortunately they have a lot of possibilities to defend themselves. First of all, they have an enormous set of antibiotics that they gather from plants by gathering propolis, by gathering pollen, and by gathering nectar. So these substances, their food is full of antibiotics, and their house is enveloped also in a layer that is antibiotic, and so it's difficult for the pathogens to enter. Then, yesterday we've talked about hygienic behavior and grooming in bees. Those are behaviors, and in our case it was against the parasite Varroa, but grooming can also help, and behavioral defenses like hygienic behavior are also used against microsporidia and bacteria which attack bees. Sick larvae can also be removed by hygienic behavior, which is slightly different from the Varroa-specific hygienic behavior, but for the rest the behavior is similar. And then if that is not enough, and that's what we have to talk about for the rest of this talk, is they have also an immune system like we have. So there is resistance through an immune response. And so I think you think we're way off answering this question about the old queen leaving, but I promise we'll get there in the end. And first we have to go through this exercise to understand what's going on. So we will look at the immune system of bees, because for the immune system of bees, those mutations would be very important. And I've argued that there are not enough of those. But bees have something else. They have something which is called a very high recombination rate. And in a while I will explain you what that is. And then they have all sorts of other attributes that I first didn't realize they were connected to their defense against pathogens. But the more and more I've thought about it, I've realized that all these 5 points are very important, and some of them, they work together to make bees resistant against new pathogens or new mutations of old pathogens. And part of that is what they call the panmictic population structure. And another one is what's called the extreme polyandry of queens. Now all those terminology from biologists we will translate in real stuff in a second. But to my surprise, when I was thinking about the problem of the old queen leaving, I realized that the old queen leaving is part of their defense against pathogens. So that already gives you a glimpse of where this talk is going to. And then in the last place, there is extreme sexual selection in drones. I have made calculations showing that if a bee colony produces 20,000 drones during a season, there are only 2 drones of those 20,000 that will pass on their genes to the next generation. So 1 in 10,000 drones is successful, which is very poor. And that means that there is enormous competition between drones. Now I should first explain you this extreme polyandry. It simply means that a queen mates with between 10 and 20 drones, and that she keeps the semen of all those drones and uses to get children, which means that the workers in a colony, they are not all full sisters, but there are groups that have the same father, and those groups, they are genetically different from each other. And that may already be a puzzle for the bacteria. Maybe they can attack one of those families, one of these patrilines, as it's called, but not all. Or maybe almost all, but then there is one maybe that is resistant. So that is spreading the risk. Now, the panmictic population structure. A panmictic population structure means that bee queens mate with drones that come from maybe far away, maybe closer nearby, but from a large population over a large area. It could be that a queen recruits the drones she mates with, and that those drones come from an area of 250 square kilometers. So that's a large population, and it's a well-mixed population. That's what is important. Now I have to explain recombination rate. And a recombination rate is, in fact, the mixing of chromosomes. So we know that these bees, they don't have mutations, so they do not many, so they do rarely acquire a real new allele. But what they can do is they can mix the genes of father and mother. So when a queen is going to lay an egg, there's a whole process that makes that the genes of the mother, of her mother, and the genes of her father, they come together in, when the cell divides, and then the similar chromosomes are laying side by side. And what happens then before the cells really divide and become haploid eggs with only one set of chromosomes, there are parts of each chromosome that break, and that's genetically predetermined, and they break at the same spot. And then a piece of the mother's chromosome goes to the father's chromosome, and the part that has come off the father's chromosome goes to the mother's chromosome. The result of that is that you don't get new alleles, but you get new combinations of alleles. And that's very important, because new combinations of alleles on one chromosome makes that genes can, if possible, collaborate in their fight against the bacteria. Now, all animals and all plants that reproduce sexually, they have recombination. And we have also recombination, so there's in each of your chromosomes, on average, there is one of those exchanging of pieces of chromosomes per generation. And honeybees, they are again extremely exceptional. They have a recombination rate which is 20 times as high as our recombination rate. 20 times as high as the recombination rate of all mammals. And although there are other insects with higher recombination rates, like bumblebees, honeybees still have a very much higher rate of recombination. So there is something special with recombination. Why do bees have this high recombination rate? Now, theoretical biologists have done calculations which seem to prove that recombination rate is an adaptation against the mutation rate of pathogens. And so they make new genetic variants, not by mutation, but by recombination. And now there's something interesting which they also discovered. I said the adaptive value of recombination is that it may bring together good alleles from different genes that can collaborate in their battle against the pathogens. But you can imagine, if you continue to increase the recombination rate, that at some point there is also a good probability that you play apart good combinations of genes. And that's not good. So there is somewhere is an optimal recombination rate. And so these Japanese theoreticians then calculated how the optimal recombination rate depends on the challenge by bacteria and viruses. And they found the higher the challenge by bacteria and viruses, the higher you make the mutation rate of the bacteria and viruses, the higher the recombination rate comes out of that simulation model on evolution. So you cannot study it directly, but the theory at least says recombination rate is a way to fight against bacteria. I want to add one thing, really to show how exceptional the bees are. When you go home from this conference, then maybe you have picked up a nasty virus or a nasty bacteria, because you've been mixing with so many people. And if so, you go to your doctor and he says, oh, well, I see this is a bacterial infection. I will give you antibiotics. And you have to swallow 3 pills per day. And you have to do that during 10 days, and then you will be healthy again, the bacteria will be gone. Now imagine you are a bee. You are a bee and you have been at the National Honey Show, and you have acquired some bacterial illness, and your bee doctor says, I'll subscribe antibiotics. You have to swallow 60 pills per day. That's the difference between us and honeybees. So in terms of the recombination rate, it's really way out. So that's very important. Going back to our queen, and the queen has that problem that there are all these fast-growing pathogens, and these pathogens, during a season, they adapt. And it's very interesting. So you have a colony, it has all its defenses in place, but there are bacteria and viruses that are still attacking our bees. And what happens is the following. The queen is there during the whole season. So the genetics of the hive, of the bees in the hive, does not change. That's constant. But the bacteria and the viruses, they are competing with each other, and they are mutating, producing new strains. And so there's competition among the viruses and the bacteria during the season in the beehive, and they become more virulent because the bacteria and the viruses that produce most offspring are the winners. So during the season, inside a hive, there is selection on the bacteria to become more virulent. If the old queen would stay, the next season, the genetic composition of the beehive would still be the same. But the bacteria have evolved during the winter, and they will continue to evolve during the next season. So the situation becomes worse for the bees. The illnesses which are already inside our colony will get more and more severe. Compare that to the fact that the old queen leaves and there is a new queen. Now the new queen mates with drones which are different than the drones her mother mated with. So the genetic composition of the old hive changes immediately and enormously. And that's a problem for the bacteria because they were very happy in adapting to the old genetic structure. So by changing queens, you can shake off the virulent bacteria. And now, of course, the old queen leaves with 60% of the workers, and she takes with her the bacteria that were already there and the viruses that were already there. Maybe not all, maybe some live only in the brood, and those she doesn't take with her. So maybe by leaving herself, she will do slightly better. But one of the reasons that swarms are not so good in surviving may be because they take this burden of pathogens with them when they move. Now, the interesting thing is that this is a hypothesis. So I myself, I think it is the only reasonable explanation for the problem of the old queen leaving. And the good thing of this hypothesis is that you can test it experimentally, because you can have bees that you do not expose to a normal beekeeper's routine. You don't help them, you don't feed them, but you prevent that the old queen leaves, and then you look at the survival of the old queen and you compare that with the survival of nests that have changed queens. Now, I wrote to Tom Seeley to ask if he had data on that, but he doesn't have that. But he could be the one to do those things. But we can all do it if we wish. And I think it's important to answer these riddles. In particular, because beekeepers, if they have a good queen, they do not like to lose that queen, so they clip a wing and they keep it for another season. And now the interesting thing is that what was a good queen this year may not be a good queen next year, because the environment has changed. The illnesses are more virulent. So this question, which is a question of evolutionary biology, has also practical repercussions for beekeeping. And I have to apologize that I cannot get any further with this problem. But for the moment, this is what I have to say about it. And it's interesting, so that we now must decide that the queen leaving with a swarm, the old mother leaving, is a form of altruistic behavior. And evolutionary biologists have always doubted whether altruistic behavior could evolve, because you should benefit yourself and not others. And but this is a case where the old queen is not doing herself a great service, but the gains for her daughter may compensate for the losses that she leads, and she may have no choice simply because she cannot get rid of her pathogens.
It struck me while you were speaking that I haven't read all the works of Tom Seeley, so maybe this is known already, but it struck me it might be interesting to look at the survival rates of swarms which were primary swarms versus secondary swarms, because the primary swarm obviously has the original queen, but a secondary swarm has a new queen.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Tom on that, because I, as a beekeeper, know there's more than one swarm. And it gets, of course, very difficult if you want to calculate fitnesses, that you also have to consider what happens with the second swarm. And so I asked him what he thought of that problem, and his answer was very short. He said, the estimated survival of the second swarm is 0.
No.
In nature, that is. He'd never seen that the second swarm had been able to survive the first winter.
Not what I was expecting. Surprising.
Yeah, but I think it made me think about why bees that we keep to have more than one swarm. Because why would they swarm if the survival rate is 0? But maybe it is because we take good care of our bees and have done that for thousands of years, that our bees under domestication have changed their behavior in making more swarms. And also because we let them live in luxury, we feed them and we give them a lot of space, they can afford to do it. So maybe second swarms are something that we have produced.
When I started looking at your probabilities, I thought, well, if there's a probability of 80% of the remaining colony and a probability of 26%, the probability of survival then is 1.06, which means in the long term bees will survive.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, why are we going any further? And then I realized that what I was thinking about is what is the probability of bees surviving.
Of colonies.
And that is not your question. Your question is, why is it advantageous?
Right. But,
Right.
the two articles I cited in this talk were on life history of bees. Mm-hmm. And Tom Seeley there was interested in the probability of survival because he wanted to calculate whether the population of bees in Arnott Forest would grow or dwindle or stay at level. And it turns out that the figures that he found for the survival of the old nests and the new nests makes that the population remains stable. So you don't need a lot of survival to have a stable population. And that was also the point that he said, bees in nature are under strong competition. So there is selection on survival, but there's no selection on maximizing reproduction.
It's an observation on the queen, the old queen leaving, taking 60% of the colony with her, and that's got the existing pathogens that she doesn't want. So to be 100% efficient, they would have to produce eggs, so she'd have to be viable when she leaves, but not at the end of her life in terms of fertility. For the bees to actually, the workers to create a supersedure cell, thereby getting rid of the old queen, and that new queen can then mate with new drones and get rid of those pathogens. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what you say is correct, and I thought it was interesting that I couldn't hear it totally well, but that you say, see, a young queen starts without pathogens.
No, the young queen would mate with new drones and introducing more resistance.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the old queen would die or be kicked out because she's lost fertility. They would make a supersedure cell anyway,
yeah,
and continue with the health of the new colony.
Yeah. Yeah, it's correct, but again, you must have noticed that I try to answer the questions on a different time scale that beekeepers normally use to answer questions.
Quite, yeah.
And that's where the difference comes from.
Thank you.
Any other questions, please? In that case, may I ask one? Honeybees evolved in isolation, the various subspecies and the evolutionary lineages, yeah, in isolation. Do you think the old queen leaving was formed before they left Africa or individually in isolation.
Yeah, what I could find was that African mother queens also leave. So that it has evolved at the basis of the species. I couldn't find any evidence for the other 10 honeybee species that we have. It would be interesting to know if they also swarm with the old queen, because if that's the case, then the origin of the behavior is even much deeper in the evolution.
Yeah. So it would have been before that she left Africa and then dispersed, yeah.
The bees, of course, I don't know if you know the story of the origin of bees, but the oldest fossil bees have been found in Europe. So it seems that their origin is in Europe. But then they then lived over the whole world, also in North America. And then they went extinct in North America and in Europe. But before extinction, they had moved to Asia. And in Asia, they have formed different species. So all the honeybee species that exist on Earth now occur in Asia. Asia is the center of diversity of honeybees. But from Asia, where you had the eastern honeybee that I displayed yesterday as the host of the Varroa mite, that's the parent species of the eastern honeybee, and the western honeybee lived in Asia. The eastern honeybee stayed there, but a branch of that emigrated to Africa, and there diversified in many different subspecies in all sorts of ecological circumstances, and recolonized Europe. And so it's a very complicated story. Yeah. But what we can do now is look at the existing bee species and study their behavior. And if all those 11 species of honeybees that exist have their old queen leaving, then we know that it's old behavior. If it's only the western honeybee, yeah, then we know that the behavior comes from Africa. But that's also something, it's not in the literature. They're good questions, but there's still so much research to do in honeybees.
Looking at the timings of when swarms actually leave, it may have occurred for the reasons of losing pathogens, but did it become reinforced by the fact that the survivability of a swarm leaving with the old queen is possibly higher than a swarm leaving with a new queen? An old queen can leave with a swarm at, say, day 8 or 9 after the queen cells are started. Providing they can find a home rapidly, the queen can be fed up, brought back into lay. Comb can be created very quickly, overnight. There can be comb for a queen to lay in. If you look at the new queen, she doesn't emerge from the cell until day 16. By the time she's fed up for 2 or 3 days to get her into breeding condition and does her orientation flights, she then has to go out and mate and be fed up again before she starts laying. So a swarm leaving with the old queen possibly has a week or 2 advance of getting a nest built before the autumn comes in than a swarm leaving with the new queen. So has that reinforced the fact that the old queen should leave with the prime swarm rather than the new queen? Just a thought.
Yeah, it's again the difference in time scale that we talk about. You try to explain the problem from how it is now, how it is already now, but what I do is I say it cannot have been all the time. So of course there are all these adaptations, like in the beginning when I said the worker bees chase the old queen. That's behavior that has also evolved. And the fighting between queens in a colony, that has also been, so there's a whole suite of behaviors that exists now, but by looking at how it's now, we cannot understand what the origin is. So you have to go back in time And that's what I have done. And then all these things, they come out of it.
If you take a queen away from a colony, or a colony is queenless for any length of time during the summer, during the honey flow, very often you can get a lot of nectar come in very quickly, simply because there's no brood to feed.
Yeah.
And I know it's English conditions, but I've certainly had a couple of supers filled quickly. And I'm just wondering if perhaps the natural brood break of the old queen going allows the parent colony to build up stores.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the swarm has got a queen that's ready to lay straight away, not wait 8 days or so.
Yeah, they must build their nest.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
perhaps it's just a fairly simple solution.
Well, it helps, yes. It's very interesting and it's measurable, so we should do that.